Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be talking about a pretty intriguing and somewhat controversial study about mammoths, or actually about a potential revival of this now extinct species. Something that has been discussed before, but something that has now become an actual reality with money behind it. Which means that, since this is sort of controversial, I'd also like to hear your opinions. So once you finish watching the video, let me know in the comments what you think about all of this. But let's start with the species itself. So today we know that mammoth existed in a lot of different habitats on the planet. It was actually a pretty widespread species. Statistically speaking, it was probably one of the most common large species around most regions on the planet. For example, there's this really interesting cave in France, the cave that you see right here known as the Ruffignac cave, that contains a tremendous number of ancient art representing different types of animals. And of hundreds of animals represented, 70% of them are mammoth. And so these animals were pretty common. They first appeared somewhere in Africa about 5 million years ago, and then spread across pretty much all major continents, creating quite a large variety of the subspecies, with slightly different features and even different sizes. But most of our initial discoveries and understanding about this animal came from the iconic woolly mammoth that you see right here. This animal appeared approximately 400,000 years ago, and lived across large regions of North Europe, North Asia, and also parts of North America as well. And this was also the last member of the species that survived until the end. The last members survived on some of the northern islands, such as the Russian Wrangel Island, or the island in Alaska known as St. Paul, finally disappearing approximately 4,000 years ago. And this is actually what most people don't realize. Mammoth was still around during the Bronze Age, when the humans were creating a lot of different pottery in the Middle East and when the Egyptians were building pyramids. But then they disappeared, for one reason or another. It could be because of the climate change, it could also be because of overhunting by early humans, or it could be a bit of both and possibly something else. At the moment nobody really knows, and it's really difficult to establish the exact reasons. What we do know, however, is that mammoths used to be pretty much everywhere, and they also used to play an important role in maintaining certain ecosystems, especially in Northern Europe. Quick fun fact, if you ever wondered where the word mammoth came from, the story behind this is somewhat interesting. In 16th and 17th century, a lot of peasants living in Siberia kept discovering these unusual tusks that were often found along the riverbanks. And not knowing what exactly they were looking at, the peasants started to refer to these as mammoth's horn, with the legend describing these unusual creatures living in the water or possibly inside the ground and only coming out at certain times, usually at night or during certain weather. But sometimes they would also find a frozen sample, an entire mammoth, and so the legend of Mammon now included this animal that most likely only lived underground and would actually perish if it came to the surface, and so this is sort of how they explained what they were finding. Interestingly enough, these discoveries and this legend even made its way to China, where this mammoth ivory became quite popular, with the animal being referred to as yin shu, which means hidden rodent. And so a lot of people back in the days believed that a lot of these horns and a lot of these samples were coming from an actual animal living underground. And that was the legend of Mammon and his tooth, which then transformed into the word mammoth. Anyway, I got sidetracked. So back to the research. So there's this new bioengineering venture called Colossal. The venture, whose goal is essentially to try to bring back the mammoths from extinction. And very recently they also announced that they collected $15 million research grant to try to make this happen. And from people behind the startup, they refer to this de-extinction as a kind of a disruptive way of preserving and conserving nature. And so this is where I guess things get a little bit more controversial. With the controversy being the fact that, well, is this actually a good way for us to preserve a species or to try to save a species? Would bringing mammoth back from the dead disrupt the current ecosystem and potentially cause more problems? Well, the scientists behind this proposition do not think so. I'll talk more about this in a few minutes. Let's start with the actual technique they're planning to use. So here they're talking about using CRISPR, the well-established genetic technique that uses a bacterial DNA in order to modify the genome of a certain species by cutting and inserting various other pieces of DNA. And in this case, they're planning to use the DNA from various frozen mammoths found on the planet and insert them into DNA of most likely an Asian elephant, the closest relative of mammoth. They do share approximately 99% of DNA. and the resulting offspring would not really be 100% mammoth. It would most likely be some sort of a hybrid, in this case something we can refer to as the mammophant. It might possess certain features and certain behaviors from the extinct mammoths, but for the most part it would be most likely its own species. As a matter of fact, this is the other controversy or the other problem. DNA itself is not everything. A typical species of a typical complex animal often relies on a lot of changes from the nature itself and from the environment. For example, today we know that an elephant will often acquire a lot of different bacteria that are used for example, digestion from its parents. They do this in a kind of a gross way by eating their parents' poop. But it's very likely that mammoths had very different bacteria in their bellies compared to a modern elephant. And today we know that these bacteria do influence a lot of things, including behavior. At the same time, it's very likely that mammoths taught their offspring certain types of behavior that are no longer taught by modern elephants. And so the behavior and various types of features learned from observing their own species would be completely lost for these hybrids. But nevertheless, the technology and the money is definitely there. And according to the website that you can find in the description below, the actual mission is most likely going to proceed. Which means that in a few years from now, we might have our first hybrid mammophant. But the reason why the scientists in this paper decided to do this kind of sort of makes sense. Here's how they presented their argument. We know that back in the days, Siberia used to be essentially a large steppe. Here we're talking about the extremely large grassland that existed across most of the North Europe and North Asia. And this was there up until about 12,000 years ago, when a dramatic shift in climate dramatically changed the entire environment, causing all of these mammoths to essentially go extinct. You can find this paper describing a lot of these events in the description below. But the scientists also believe that mammoths were actually instrumental in maintaining vast regions of steppe and in maintaining this ecosystem for thousands or possibly even millions of years. And so here the scientists think that, well, if we were to make a bunch of mammoths and if we were to release them into this tundra today, the same area where mammoths used to exist thousands of years ago, there is a slight chance that because of their activity, they might be able to reinvigorate a lot of the areas here by essentially mixing the grasslands, by providing a lot of nutrition through their dung, and by transforming the entire ecosystem into something a little bit more functional, including possibly now having plants that can capture carbon and thus reduce the overall effects of the climate change. And there are obviously examples of extinct animals being reintroduced where this did kind of work. For example, the reintroduction of extinct wolves into the Yellowstone Park had some major positive impacts on the entire ecosystem of the national park. So something similar could happen if the scientists were to reintroduce mammoths into the Arctic and into northern Siberia. Especially since it's very likely not going to do much more damage and it's not really going to make things worse. And since a lot of things in Siberia are already melting and thawing, and even the permafrost is slowly disappearing, this might also give the animals a higher chance to survive and to potentially improve the ecological system, allowing for a lot more plants to survive in those regions. But at the same time, a lot of scientists believe that this is maybe a complete waste of resources, and all of the money and resources could be used in a lot better, more practical ways. For example, at least one paper explores this in detail, discovering that overall effects could actually be detrimental and not positive. So this type of de-extinction could be an interesting experiment, but it could be extremely damaging. At the same time, the scientists also mentioned this idea as a kind of a moral challenge. If we actually start believing that de-extinction is possible and can always be done, are we going to stop caring about trying to preserve current species and trying to preserve the current ecosystem as it is? If people start believing that you can always bring the animal back, they might actually stop caring completely. And that by itself is probably a much bigger problem. The extinction should not become something common, something that's everywhere. It could be an interesting single experiment, but making this commonplace, especially if it's going to be destructive in the long term, might actually create more problems than solve. At least that's what a lot of scientists currently believe. Nevertheless, the question is kind of interesting. I mean, hypothetically speaking, from a somewhat science fiction perspective, we know that several major extinction events occurred in the past, and we now are sort of headed for another one. But because of this technology, we could in theory completely reverse it through this idea of CRISPR and introducing genes into other species. Now that's obviously something that's way beyond our ability right now, but because of this technology and because of the idea of using genetic technology to preserve a species, at least in theory, humans could potentially completely prevent the extinction events from happening, which by itself is the definition of playing God, which is not what everyone agrees with. But considering the total price tag on this is essentially the price of a single rocket launch by SpaceX, well, I guess it's maybe worth trying. I personally don't really know where I stand on this, but I'm also sort of curious. Now, what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Is it worth bringing them back? Is it worth trying to reintroduce them into the ecosystem they used to exist in? And what do you think is going to happen? Anyway, we'll talk more about this in some of the future videos once we have more information. Meanwhile, check out all of the articles in the description below, subscribe if you still haven't, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, and maybe come back tomorrow to learn something else. Maybe support this channel on Patreon by joining a channel membership or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.